Philippine art has evolved through history after history. Various forms of arts in the Philippines have developed and collected from the beginning of civilization in the country up to the contemporary era that we are in today. Since that day, we are already rich in various arts you can think of: paintings, music, architecture, dance, literature, weaving, carving, pottery, calligraphy, and many more. This art reflects its society and non-Filipinos the wide range of cultural influences of the country's culture and how these influences hone the country's arts. So to finally introduce you to the history of the Philippine arts, let this video be your time machine to go back to the past until we can meet her again in the present. In 3, 2, 1.
Even before the Spanish, American, and Japanese colonizer came, indigenous Filipinos already had their own art, literature, and architecture. Back then, the Philippines already had art that was considered one of a kind and rich. During that time, arts such as pottery, for example, the manunggul jar, carving the bulol from Ifugao, weaving, for example, the Pinilian hand weaving from Ilocos region, metalworks such as kampilan and talibung used in slashing and chopping, and also metallic harpoon and arrowheads. Literature such as the hudud chants of the Ifugao and Baybayin, personal ornaments such as plenty of gold jewelry, and the batok tattoo, which is usually practiced in almost all ethnic groups in the Philippines during the pre-colonial era. Architecture also exists during that time. The earliest records of pre-colonial architecture in the Philippines are rock shelters and caves in Palawan.
Next is the Islamic colonial period. Islam as a religion has long been established since the early Anno Domini 600. Along with its emergence around the world, it also paved way to the development of its own unique style of art. Islamic art places emphasis on creating an art form that is built on the beauty and respect for the teaching of Islam. The Islamic colonial period emerged in Sulu during the 13th century when the Arabian Sayyid Abu Bakr arrived. During his reigning era, he promulgated the first Sulu code of laws called Diwan that were based on the Quran. He introduced Islamic political institutions and the consolidation of Islam as the state religion. In terms of arts that evolved during this time is their traditional art form known as okir. They are believed to have originated from the much earlier okil or okil-okil. Other groups also adapted the Sama okir styles, such as the panolong of the Torogan became a symbol of power and status.
Going to the next period is the Spanish colonial period, when the Spaniards arrived in the Philippines in 1521. The colonizer used art as a tool to propagate a Catholic faith through beautiful images, with communication as problem. The friars used image to explain concept behind Catholicism, and to tell stories Christ's life and passion. Images of Holy Family and saints were introduced to Filipino psyche through carved santos. The Via Crucis and the Station of a Cross, engravings on estampas and estampitas, and through painting on church wall.
Sculptors during this era were also recognized, and they are Juan de los Santos, Crispulo Locson, Romualdo de Jesus, Leoncio Asuncion, and Isabelo Tampinco. The second half of the 19th century, as travel in and around the country considerably improved, saw a marked increase in the demand for non-religious souvenirs. Post del Pais, meaning human types of the country's sculptures, which ordinary people doing everyday activities and wearing their local costume became the favorite. Damian Domingo y Gabor was the most popular artist who worked in this style. Flores' two extant works, Primeras Letras and Feeding the Chicken, showed the close bond between mother and child. In 1593, the Dominicans published the La Doctrina Cristiana en Lengua Española y Tagala, or the Christian Doctrine in the Spanish and Tagalog language, which is the first book printed in the country. On wood carving, there's woodcut engraving of Saint Dominic by Juan de Veira, a Chinese convert. The religious orders owned printing presses and printed mostly prayer books and estampas. The estampas, which are the prints of miraculous images, usually featured portraits of saints and religious scenes. Estampas and estampitas, which is the smaller version of the estampas, were distributed during town fiestas to the natives.
From one colonizer to another. After more than 3 centuries of Spanish rule, the Americans came. They set out to conquer the Filipinos through education and governance. With the arrival of the new colonial power came a shift in art patronage, from the native illustrados to the Americans. The new patrons, including the tourists and foreign investors, favored landscapes, still life, and genre themes that show the beauty of the land and its people. Some of the well-known classical painters in this era are the following. Fabian de la Rosa was the first painter of note for the 20th century. He was noted for his realistic portraits, genre, and landscape in subdued colors. And Fernando Amorsolo. He is de la Rosa's nephew, which is the most famous for his paintings burst with yellow, orange, and golden sunlight, such as the planting rice under the mango tree and his trademark Dalagang Bukid. He also designed for commercial products, the most famous of which is the Marcang Demonio for Ginebra San Miguel, a local alcoholic drink. He was named as the first country's national artist in 1972. In sculpture, it was Guillermo Tolentino, 1890 to 1976. Trained in the classical style in Rome, Tolentino's masterpieces include the Oblation of University of the Philippines and the Bonifacio Monument in Caloocan. But it would be Tolentino's student, Napoleon Abueva, who would go against the standards set by his teacher. Working with a variety of materials and techniques, Abueva integrated the sculptural and functional qualities in his works.
During the first half of the century, Filipino artists did not seem to be interested in the art of printmaking. It was only in the early 1960s that interest in printmaking seemed to develop in the country. 2 people were responsible for this. First is Manuel Rodrigo Sr. was given a grant by Rockefeller Foundation to study printmaking in New York. For his enormous influence in the reemergence of printmaking in the country, he is known as the father of Philippine printmaking. Some of his notable works included The Traveler and Nepohan Badonan, and the second is Rodolfo Parras Perez, who specialized in colored woodcut. One of his notable works is The Kiss, which shows the figure locking the torrid embrace.
However, everything changed with the advent of World War II in Asia with the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 8, 1941. It was the Japanese colonizers' goal to place the country under the autonomous Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere under their leadership. For the 4 years of Japanese occupation from 1941 to 1945, the colonizers, as a means of propaganda, used the visual arts. They produced posters, leaflets, flyers, comics, and illustrations that were dropped from passing airplanes. These included color drawings, watercolors, photographs, photomontages, or calendar illustrations. Some of example of these works are Vicente Alvarez Dizon's A Day Begins, Crispin B. Lopez Baguio Market, and Emilio G. Santiago's Christian Eve, made in 1942, which shows a traditional Filipino scene that evokes nostalgia. However, there are also some notable patriotic paintings alluding to the social conditions of the time, such as Pilar M. Santiago's Evacuees, Irineo Miranda's Home from Work, and Simon Saulog's Conspiracy, which allows a group of men in an evening meeting, which suggests to the underground anti-Japanese movement. There are also paintings depicting more atrocities like the Metro Diego's Capas, Diosdado Lorenzo's atrocities in Paco and execution at the cemetery, and Dominador Castañeda's Doom family. All these paintings were done after the war. Due to World War II, many artworks, buildings, and lives were being destroyed. But this was when modern art was slowly making its name known to the world.
Finally, in the era of contemporary art in the Philippines, The history of contemporary Philippine art traverses a vibrant terrain of artistic practices that delicately and urgently mediate the modernity of art history, institutions, exhibition making, and the expansive activity of curatorial work. Performs this range of gestures to speak to and intervene in the ever-changing political milieu and the vast ecology as well as ethnicity of the archipelago.
It started during martial law 1972 to 1981. One of the first orders of then-President Ferdinand Marcos was to seize and control or privately owned newspapers, magazines, television and radio stations, and other media companies. The Cultural Center of the Philippines, or CCP, which opened in September 1969, is an important institution in this history. The CCP was founded during the term of President Ferdinand Marcos, with the First Lady Imelda Marcos securing the funds for its construction and serving as its first chairperson. It's the country's first world-class venue, showcasing the best of Philippine music, dance, theater, film, literature, design, and visual arts. Independent publishing persisted in the 1970s and 1980s despite state censorship and media clampdown. Privately funded publications such as Ermita and San Juan were produced and circulated by the art and literary circles in Manila. First published in 1976 by Boy Wenko with Alfred A. Yusan as editor, Ermita described itself as an alternative newspaper and a community publication. Along the same lines, San Juan was deliberated by Monthly Magazine of Art, published in the 1980s by artist Agnes Arellano's The Pinaglabanan Galleries. After martial law was lifted in 1981 by Marcos, the press regained their freedom and many privately owned broadsheets and newspapers opened or resumed operations, including Philippine Free Press, the Manila Chronicle, and the Manila Times.
Formally integrated in 1992 during the presidency of Fidel Ramos, the NCCA started a new era in democratization and Philippine art. Mandated to support the development of a pluralistic culture and to integrate traditional culture as a dynamic part of the national mainstream, it enforced a shift towards the Philippinization of the country's museum and cultural policies. Around the same time, the newly formed Department of Art Studies at the University of the Philippines, or UP, where many of the country's eminent art critics and writers were based, changed their curriculum to include the creative endeavors of marginalized Philippine communities as well as popular art forms. While major broadsheets such as Manila Bulletin, Philippine Daily Inquirer, Philippine Star, Business World, and mainstream commercial publications, including the art and lifestyle magazine Art Plus, continue to feature art, they are more often promotional writings prepared by galleries rather than critical. The transition to digital platform around the turn of the century have been proposed challenges, as well as the possibilities in the production and dissemination of information of contemporary art in the Philippines. An example is Control P, an online journal initiated by artist Judy Simbayanan and feminist art historian Flodette Mayda Tuin in 2006. Other forms of art are also involved during this era, such as photography, media art, installation art, printmaking, intervention art, and many more.
It is amazing to know all of these improvements and history of the art in our own country. There might be flaws and imperfections, but it is still became a part of our lives, especially we are Filipino. We just need to embrace it and treasure it more, so that the future generations can still have an access on these arts and for them to get an inspiration from it.